These spikes that I mentioned beforehand, I'm afraid will probably not go down too much since we still want to have very good latency. And the loss rates, I think, will manage to keep as low as they are, or maybe even a bit lower. It comes a bit at the cost of buffer utilization in the terminals, since you have to buffer up to the packet delay budget or a few times the packet delay budget. So that is the downside of it, but anyway, I think. At the moment, we assume that the IETF guys will assume that there are no transmission-related losses, and that's what increase these are. That closes my part of the discussion.
There is, if you have any clarifying questions, then we're up to it. If you want to start discussion, we better wait. The first person who is going to ask the question, please pick up that microphone and bring it to the front. Nobody? Okay, then over to Blake. Thank you.
So I spent a lot of my time at Facebook trying to figure out how to deliver an experience to a person in 300 to 500 milliseconds. So just to kind of set the stage for why that's challenging, there's a few things. One, you guys have probably all at some point used an application on your phone, probably gotten into an elevator or gone into a basement, and suddenly it's either really slow, you completely drop off the network, and applications really rarely handle this correctly. Generally, application developers sort of think about ideal conditions, not actual conditions. So in terms of actual conditions, we generally target 1.5 seconds as P50 round trip time in emerging markets, and that's really like an important area for us. So that means that 50% of users, the round trip time for them from their UE to server infrastructure is going to be 1.5 seconds. So right away, that makes my job kind of hard. Getting to 300 to 500 milliseconds, there's not a lot of cheating the speed of light and some of the radio technologies. So the other two constraints in here, one is, I would guess that the majority of this room, you probably have pretty modern devices. They were probably made in 2014, 2015. In emerging markets, it's really common for people to have new handsets or new to them that were developed in 2010 or 2011. And then on the network side, kind of ideally you're looking at LTE or 3G, but we still see quite a bit of 2G radio networks out there. And then even the 3G networks that we do see, they're highly congested, they're oversubscribed, and the performance of them is not ideal. So that's kind of like what the world looks like from my perspective. Now, this might be okay, but modern protocols, or if you generally think about the experience of firing up your web browser on your phone, firing up Facebook or WhatsApp or most of the applications you have on your phone, the really typical thing that's going to happen is you're going to do a DNS lookup, you're going to make a TCP connection, you're going to do the TLS dance, and then you're finally going to get to issue a HTTP GET request, right? So to say, hey, please give me back some data, something that can fill in this view. And this is kind of the most common experience that people have. If you're an application developer and you're just thinking, all right, I'm going to spin up my application, I'm going to serve some data, you're going to use HTTP because this is kind of how people do internet communication, at least largely, and it's certainly how Facebook does. So we have modern protocols, but we don't necessarily have modern devices. Network infrastructure takes a long time to improve. I think some of the recent proposals and some of the things we've been looking at Facebook is moving more of the network into user space. And what I mean when I say that is, one of the things that was really exciting for us was TCP fast open. So, being able to avoid the full handshake, this is really exciting. As far as I know, for major handset vendors, this is still not widely rolled out, and this isn't necessarily this is more of an infrastructure issue than a protocol issue, right? So we're thinking, okay, well, why don't we move some of this stuff into user space and maybe move a little bit quicker, right? So I don't think this is a good solution for a number of reasons, or I don't think it's a complete solution necessarily. In general, the approach that we've been taking from an application standpoint is trying to evolve how we actually think about the network and the resources that we have. And this means a few things. So I think the most important thing is, the mental model that most application developers have for the network is it's this always on, always fast connectivity, and you kind of have to throw that out and say that it's best effort and you may not have connectivity anytime soon. One thing that's pretty different about just thinking about application development in general is you have this trade-off between perceived performance, battery, and data usage, right? So things that you might do that would improve perceived performance for an end user might actually drain the battery, might actually increase data usage, and for users that pay by the byte, increasing data usage is problematic, right? So the trade-offs you have to make are subtle and not always obvious. Recently, we've been looking at adaptive protocol selection. So what this means is, based on current network conditions, changing the best suite of protocols to use. And when I say protocols, I mean sort of the layer, is it TCP or UDP? What are you going to do for crypto? What are you going to do for compression? What are you going to do for framing? And that's generally sort of the building blocks that I'm thinking about. The problem is the building blocks are not as composable as might be ideal. So, generally the first thing you need to do is you need some notion of real-time measurement or near real-time. Like, what are the conditions that the user is operating under? This can help inform the protocol selection decisions that you make, right? But doing this is actually tricky, partially because of APIs and things like that. You don't necessarily have current access to things like loss or congestion or information like that would help you make the correct decision. So this becomes a problem. Then you kind of run into, okay, just starting at the bottom, you're thinking about TCP, UDP, sort of your base transport, right? How do you actually go about making that decision? So, with IPv6, when we were rolling out, we had happy eyeballs, right? Happy eyeballs only started showing up on, sort of, well, say, major handsets in Q3 of 2015. This is something we've had for a really long time, but most applications, if they've been using happy eyeballs for address selection, they've rolled their own. We have the same problem for TCP and UDP, where middle boxes might do things with your traffic that you don't expect, and so you can't just say, oh, let's always use this. You have to take a lot more information into account when you make those decisions. We don't have those building blocks yet. What crypto do you choose? So there's trade-offs when you're thinking about crypto that have to do with sort of the maturity of the protocol that you're thinking about, the performance, the byte-wise efficiency, CPU time, network efficiency. Like, these are all things that you have to consider, and when you don't have perfect information about current conditions, and you don't actually have sort of great building blocks for the crypto, it's pretty hard to make some of those decisions. The same is true for compression. So some of you might have remembered needing to disable header compression for Speedy due to the crime attack, and this happened. This wasn't completely specific to Speedy, but this was a case where people were using compression in a way that seemed totally reasonable, and some really smart folks figured out this actually leaks information, right? So again, compression is another thing where you need a set of really good building blocks. Obvious trade-offs, right? So you might say this is ideal for these network conditions, but there may be security implications that you haven't thought of. And then on top of that, there's sort of the what framing do you use, right? What does sort of the application layer say? So generally, kind of the conclusion that we've reached is your applications need to work well offline. You don't know when you're going to have access to the network, and when you do, you're not necessarily going to have ideal information to create an ideal experience.
Thank you. Again, clarifying questions at this point? Not yet. I think that is going to tie these two things together a bit. Or actually, nobody's going to do that.
Everything is ruined. I always like to start a talk that way, because then things can only get better from there. I'm also going to... So I wanted to pick up on some of the themes that Blake raised and to point out something that's sort of a very fundamental piece of this problem, which is that you have three different actors in this current kind of dance. It's not as fun as the TLS dance, but it's still a dance. That kind of don't get a lot of information from each other. right? So you have their radio network here, which is trying to optimize the number of people they can serve in a serving cell. They're trying to optimize the amount of energy they're putting into it. They're trying to optimize the amount of dwell time a radio is using to serve a particular user. And one of the things that I was able to kind of have a short conversation with him yesterday, he mentioned then is when somebody's in that basement and getting a data rate of 100 kilobits per second, they're taking a long time on the radio to get that 100 kilobits per second, where somebody who's getting an LTE 100 kilobits, they're on and off the radio very quickly, and their radio network as a result is far more efficient at these higher data rates than it is at the lower data rates. So they would really rather give you much higher data rates than lower data rates, and what they're optimizing for is sort of the broad class of customers they're serving in a particular cell. And how they're going to serve them is kind of their optimization. They have some connections to the handset in that because they can schedule their network, unlike say Wi-Fi, they can tell the UE how many slots it's going to get and when those slots are going to be. But the UE is actually trying to do something else. It's trying to make sure that its battery doesn't die. And it's trying to make sure that it's actually keeping itself going for as long as possible, because it doesn't know whether this particular piece of application data is going to be followed by another one, it's going to be followed by an emergency call, it's going to be followed by something much more important. And I'm driving poor Daniel crazy because I'm looking at my pages. The application, on the other hand, really wants this user experience that Blake was talking about. It wants to be very snappy. It wants to be able to give this very instant response to the kind of data that the user wants. And it doesn't know anything about what's going on in the UE below it. It doesn't know what competing applications are running. It doesn't know anything about what other things are sitting in the network stack. And it certainly doesn't know anything about the radio network beyond, perhaps, in some cases, what link type it's on. And the result of this is that each one of them is kind of doing this point optimization around its own desire, and even that has some additional pieces of the puzzle. And this is money for people who can't see it. And as Blake alluded to, one of the problems we have here is that a typical trick you might pull as an application developer to pre-cache a bunch of stuff that might be wanted to make things more snappy turns out to cost a lot of money. If you download something like Yahoo News and then pre-fill all of the DNS cache entries that you need to go to all of the linked things, what you're going to end up doing is making a whole lot of wasted bytes across the network. And that may be a problem for the radio network, it may be a problem in energy costs for the UE, and it's probably going to be a cost in dollars to somebody who's got a per megabit plan. So trying to deliver what these guys want without costing money is very difficult. And for those of you who aren't musicians, and this actually doesn't have a staff line, which is very hard, that's the common time music symbol, and what it represents is the problem of trying to deliver commonality. If I give you a startlingly different experience as an application when you have a low link capability and a high link capability, you're going to be startled all the time, right? When you're at 100 kilobits per second, the gestures you use to make the application use have shifted from HTML to WAP, to use a very old-fashioned example. You just won't know what the hell is going on as you move among radio environments. And this is the other thing that we kind of have to deal with here is that, yeah, you may be in LTE coverage and getting much less than LTE bandwidth. You may believe that you're going to be delivering a particular service because of the type of network you're on. But there's always the risk that you're at the far end of the cell sector. There are a lot of other people coming in and out, so the radio is busy. You're in a basement. People keep bringing up the basement. I'm not sure why. And the result of that is that you're kind of stuck. And what people are looking for here is an understanding of how to kind of rejigger the building blocks so that all of those optimizations work. And there's this kind of baseline question. Is what you do, you build one kind of thing that's got this incredible range. You know, it works at 100 kilobits per second, it works at 300 megabits per second, and it's incredibly effective at all of them. And whoever builds that, I really want to know them because they're a bright person. Or do you want to have these kind of swappable building blocks and use a different building block maybe you do long pull in some things and you do push notification in another, but you don't actually surface the difference to the application? Do you do these swappable building blocks and hide the fact that they're swappable? And I think that for me, I've gone way too far back here. I'm going to hear this over him. Whoa. For me, I'm going to argue that the internet needs to be more explicit. Not explicit content, we got plenty of that. But that the mechanisms by which these things talk to each other need to be much more explicit, because when this chat application wants to talk to the UE about how much battery is left and how much it has, how much battery can I use? It can't ask this UE that in any sensible fashion. The UE can't answer them in current operating systems. Yes, CinderOS from Stanford is great. It can do that better than anyone. UE can ask the radio, what's my current rate? It can tell it some things about what it wants, but it can't say, I've got 16 applications queued up behind here, and here's what the offered load is going to look like in 2 seconds or 5 seconds, because the applications can't tell it that yet. They can only look at kind of instantaneous optimization, and that doesn't work. And so I think we need to start looking at, there's an old joke, when I do it, it's a cross-layer optimization. When you do it, it's a layer violation. When he does it, it's a terrible hack. I think at the very least, we need to be thinking about optimization, and I think we might need to be willing to do some hacks. And now I guess the mic lines are open.
So, are there already questions from the audience?
That was expected.
Can you state your name?
Hi, I'm Richard, NEC. I had a question to Blake. So you alluded mainly to like optimizations that you would do on your client software or handsets. I mean, there are also a couple of things you could do on the application server side or network infrastructure side. So you could reduce round trips by maybe prefetching and bundling many web resources into like a single bundle. You could maybe move from connection security to object security. Is it something you have on your radar?
Yeah, so in terms of application optimizations, I think actually the most interesting case is we essentially have like a ping request response, right? No overhead, generated at the edge, best possible situation. This is kind of what we look at, and the types of conditions that I was describing are for that sort of artificial endpoint. We've done some of the things that you're talking about, bundling resources, stuff like that. I think generally prefetching is something that is a lot more complex than people expect, particularly on the client-driven side of it. If you end up delivering a bunch of data that the user doesn't end up needing, they're paying for it, and in emerging markets that's problematic. It's stuff we've worked with, but I think I can constrain the problem to what's the best possible case from the server side, and let's look at optimizing that. There's a lot of things we can do in terms of like, okay, we know that this user's been looking for new data every 3 to 5 minutes. Let's pre-generate it on the server side, push it up to the edge. It's waiting for the user, right? Those are all things we can do, but there's some more fundamental issues that we're still trying to figure out.
So just to add one piece to that, you mentioned the network infrastructure bump here, and I want to note that, of course, one thing that many networks try and do is to put proxies in a network which assist the end user by bringing the content closer. And those can be a very valuable tool if they're explicitly present to the end user. Right? It's really problematic when they're interception proxies and the end user doesn't know about them. But if the end user explicitly grants the proxy the right to know it, it helps cheat the speed of light, as he put it. I no longer have to go to the origin server for it because for CNN.com or let's use the BBC CO UK, the content may be a lot closer to me than it used to be.
Yep, good point.
Just I'm listening to this from a perspective of permissionless innovation and
the ability to connect for new entrants. And the answer that you just gave means that you have to have access to that infrastructure. Now, I don't want to jump the queue, but that's sort of the thing that I have in the back of my mind, and I will be returning to that question at the end, see if we learned something around that. Pete.
This is Pete Resnick.
we build up multiple places working group. So the driver, the motivation was because of the handset has two interfaces, LTE, 3G, and Wi-Fi. So if you use both of them simultaneously, then you will have lots of power consumptions. So today, most handsets is trying to use only one of them to connect to the internet. So like Facebook or some big OTT provider, they can do once you lost LTE 3G connection, then the application will automatically connect to this content provider again through Wi-Fi. Self-reconnect kind of behavior. But that is only you can do that, doesn't mean everybody can do that. So we try to let everybody know. So you have to reconnect this software connection to keep your session continuing. So this is one of what we are doing. The second thing is also because we have multiple provisioning domain either from 3G, LTE, or Wi-Fi, or ADSL, or whatever you connect. Then you have different configuration in different domains. So we have to all expose those information to the application developers to let them understand which source array you are going to use, you bind to which DNS server, and you connect to which path. So that's the work we are doing today. And right in this afternoon, 3 o'clock, if you visit the meet working group, you can see Google is presenting its application layer API to expose to the application developers. So that's one work to totally match today your kind of thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
Justin Dean, Naval Research Lab, chair of the MANA working group, Mobile Ad Hoc Networking. One thing that I've encountered a lot of, and this is sort of directed to Penny, with radios, because they're designed in a way that's supposed to give the user very high success rate and very low latency. And there's a lot of work done on all these radios. When I go to conferences and you talk to the radio designers, and like, well, can you turn that off? And they look at me like I have 3 heads. Because there are some applications, sometimes, where I want that 30% loss, get me what I can get, and I'll do something else in the application layer to get more throughput through. Say I have multiple different interfaces, and I'm doing network coding, I can do better knowing my network in the larger scheme of things versus just this one hop doing the retransmission. So that's just something I'd like to point out to anybody who's a radio developer here. And this isn't specifically LTE, this is more radio to radio kind of development. I think there is use in having kind of a raw socket, sort of how there's UDP and TCP. If I want something to go through, I use
So sort of back to basically let the edge manage it.
Yes, and you don't always want to use it, and you kind of have to know what you're doing when you're going to use it, but sometimes you do want it.
Yeah, I know there are always.
I got, yeah,
Okay. Yeah, I know there are discussions on this at the coding and that the edge is corrected. I think we have discussed it. It has been discussed in CPP as well, for LTE, for 3G, and so on. I think it's coming up every now and then. On the other hand, if you just send another packet on higher layers, it will be new data for the same link or for the other link over which you send it. And if on the radio layer you know that this is a retransmission of the lost packet, you can do quite efficient and fancy things like doing sort of combining and so forth, which you lose if it comes from the endpoints and you don't know that this packet is actually mirroring or repeating the previous packet, and you can't do those things. Therefore, so far I think on radio level people are convinced that it's most efficient in terms of network capacity if you perform the retransmission on the hop where the error occurred and not end-to-end.
I would agree with you for that link, for a given link. If you have multiple links and multiple ways out, that's not always true.
Yeah, Mike?
It's a question for Ted. So you described this model where three parties exchange, the three parties exchange explicit information. We see two kinds of problems with this. One is the fact that radio linking metadata to unwanted third parties. And the second, just closely related to this, is the fact that the receiver of this kind of assertions should be able to say this assertion is true and I can trust this information. How do you think that technically these problems can be solved? What kind of technologies do you need to?
So I think that the question you ask is an interesting one, in part because it's definitely been demonstrated that simple energy usage can be privacy impacting information. Right? And so if I tell the UE that, hey, I'm going to want a whole bunch of energy, and the UE then tells the radio network, I want a whole bunch of energy, presumably across some signal. But now the radio network knows that a whole bunch of energy is going to be going here. The question is how much information needs to get passed with that. I think, and the best way I can come back to this metaphor is the metaphor that I was talking to Pete about is this capacitance style metaphor that if I say, look, I need a bigger battery right now, or I say to the network, I need a bigger pipe right now, I absolutely shouldn't tell them what it's for, right? I've got to go get flowers because I was on Ashley Madison. No, the network shouldn't know that, right? This is not the network's business, right? But it is a problem because you're probably going to have multiple applications which are doing this, and having the applications try to individually manage the privacy characteristics of their requests is not going to work because they're not going to know what the implications are of the multiple applications being fingerprinted together. So I would actually say that just like power and network capacity, this kind of ends up in the handset UE realm of things it's got to help you with. And it's definitely in part got to help you with it by not leaking exactly which application it's asking for, trying to leak as little as possible to the network. If you don't trust the handset itself, you have other problems. And now Wendy, who doesn't trust the handset itself, is going to correct me.
Thanks, Ed. Wendy Seltzer from W3C, and I was kind of with two quick questions from the application layer. One is that there is lots of work going on at the web layer, things like service workers to think about caching and working with content offline to help applications and application developers manage the user experience of changing network conditions. And second was indeed going to be some of the privacy considerations of every piece of this information about what kind of signaling you'd like and what kind of power consumption you have can become a part of a fingerprint that can be used to identify a user against his or her wishes. And it's things at the application layer, perhaps something that's consolidating application inputs on the handset that can help the user to manage privacy preferences in balance with power consumption and network preferences. And there's some interesting research being done around the kinds of abstractions that can be built up client side to communicate preferences or to request information without revealing privacy-sensitive detail or the kinds of details that could be used to link user behavior even if they're not individually privacy-sensitive. So can we give a little bit more power back to the applications to manage those things on behalf of users?
In terms of the abstractions that are starting to show up from W3C, Facebook was one of the really early HTML5 for mobile adopters, and has since gone back to a native, meaning we've largely abandoned HTML5 in mobile. HTML5 has changed quite a bit, and so have those abstractions. I actually think in some ways the mobile ecosystem is trailing behind what some of the things that are being pushed by the W3C, and there's some things to be learned. because they're both ultimately presenting sort of a user experience regardless of what the language you happen to be using. So that's one thing where, you know, I never touch UIs, and everyone should be happy about that. But I do think there's a lot for sort of the Android, iOS ecosystem to learn from, you know, what the W3C has already done. In terms of the privacy piece, particularly around like prioritization, one thing that I think is interesting is, you know, Speedy offers it's either 16 bits or 32 bits for prioritization, and HTTP2 has sort of two mechanisms here. And what you were alluding to, which is basically everybody wants to dial it to 11. Like, even though we have, you know, say 16 bits of space, we only have received 3 priorities in production. And it's basically highest pri, not set, lowest pri. And so I think there are, you know, developers that would actually really take advantage of that kind of infrastructure. I wonder if the engineering efforts would end up being worth it. You know, given what you were saying about, you know, 3G standard having some of these features and just no integration. So.
I mean, just to point out in AT and also nowadays in EPS, there is of course a quality service framework, but it's designed in a way that the operator on the corner website can determine which traffic is supposed to receive which quality of service. And they means for identifying that this service is a service that can benefit from a certain treatment is done on IP, source destination, address, port numbers, and so forth. Unless you have a dedicated server or you know this particular service, like IMS voice, for example, operator would then mark accordingly so the base stations know exactly how to treat this, that you get maximum battery performance, maximum state capacity, and so forth. But it's a very difficult topic, I think, for operators nowadays. It is net neutrality thing, so even though we would optimize things for everyone, it might be perceived by someone as being not neutral anymore, and that's of course very difficult. But at least so far, operators want something that is controlled by the network, and where that application can, maybe the applications are not considered trustworthy from an operator point of view.
The other obvious comment there is that as we encrypt more and more traffic, the examination of it becomes more difficult. And speaking, if I were outside as a WebRTC guy, I would tell you, look, we use random ports for SRTP traffic, and if you aren't willing to let us tell you that they're a voice, then WebRTC will be sad. And we don't like you. Please don't make us sad. To go back to why it might be sad from a privacy perspective, I absolutely agree that we do need something that helps the overall ecosystem enable the kinds of privacy that fingerprinting might be hostile to. The difficulty is we can't make them part of this tension, right? Because if the application says, in order to enable privacy, I'm going to take a hit of 2 more round trips, it's going to say, hey, at the P50 latency I have in Bangalore, that's 3 seconds, and they turn off the application rather than wait. So we have to figure out ways in which the explicit content we're looking to pass among these people remains private, right? Ashley Madison failed. We have to succeed.
On that note, yeah, it's 10 to 1. I have to say, I still have questions along. We now see a tussle between battery life, radio performance, user experience, privacy. I think that the pack of money over there is an important part of this tussle. We have to negotiate between all these parties. Questions about new entrants come up and so on and so forth, and we haven't touched upon this. So with that, my brain is at least stimulated to think a little bit more about these things. I hope your brain is too. Feel free to reach out to our panelists for further discussion. And with that, I'd like to thank the participants first. Thank you. And thank you for being here and being actively engaged. I would like to remind you, please take your boxes and put them outside so that this room is clean for continuation of the IETF. Thank you very much.